Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Kiana and today I have a corset tutorial for you again. You might have noticed that from the intro that this corset that I'm doing is transparent. I did it with organza, so it's only one layer of fabric. You know, if I did a lining, then it wouldn't be transparent anymore or translucent. If you want to do it with two layers, like an opaque layer and a lining, it's super easy. It's probably easier than this, honestly, because you just put them together and then sew the binding. You don't have to do all like the extra work for the opaque panels with the eyelets in the back. So honestly, doing the double layered opaque and lining route would be easier, but I just thought this was cute. I thought it was super trendy. You can also do this method of sewing for one layer that is opaque. You can do it with anything. So I just thought I would show you guys how to do it with a translucent fabric type, this organza. Also, this pattern, of course, will be linked on Etsy, my second pattern for sale. If you don't want to go through all the work of draping, patterning, all of that, it's on Etsy, and it's also size 0 to 14 in US sizing. It's actually only in 4 sizes. It's like a 0 to 2, 4 to 6, 8 to 10, and 12 to 14. It's like a small, medium, or extra small, small, medium, large, just because it is a corset, like, and it's adjustable in the back. So for me, there's like a 2-inch opening, but it can vary depending on your waist size. It doesn't have to fit you perfectly because it is a corset and it can adjust. So this is a great thing to try out even if you are a beginner, since it doesn't have to fit you exactly. Also, something great about this pattern is that it is small little pattern pieces, so you can just print it out off your home printer and you don't have to tape any paper pieces together. So first I'm going to teach you how to drape, then I'm going to teach you how to pattern, and then I'm going to teach you how to sew this. So if you're buying the pattern, skip to the sewing section. It's right here, and then you don't have to watch all the patterning. If you want to drape it yourself, then we're going to get into it. And yeah, I hope you enjoy this tutorial. Let me know if you have any other requests or comments down below, and we're just gonna get into it now. Alright, so we're gonna get started with draping first, of course. So I'm taping out all my style lines with washi tape. You guys know I love using washi tape to tape out my style lines, and I'm just kind of making it how I want to make it. I am deciding to not really dip so far below the natural waistline all the way around because I like how that looks more. And then I'm also realizing that this dress form has an insanely long, like, area between her bust and her waist that is just absolutely not natural and not standard. So I lowered and decreased the length. Of course, I'm leaving a little bit of a space open in the back because we want this corset to lace up nice and tight. And then I'm going to move on to draping with my muslin. So of course, I have a grain line going up and down, and that will just help me stay organized later on when I go to cut out my pattern pieces. Now I'm just smoothing out the muslin and then pinning down along those style lines that we created earlier. And then I'm gonna go in with a marker and just mark out all those style lines so that when we take off our muslin, we are able to easily trace out this pattern piece. And if you guys have seen any of my other draping videos, I'm basically doing the same thing that I always do. It's the same process. I tape out my style lines, I pin it with my pins, I mark it, and then I take off my muslin and then true it up with my curved and straight rulers, so it's nice and precise and exact. After that, I cut out the pattern piece, always leaving like a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch seam allowance. That is not actually seam allowance, it's just so we can pin it back up on the form. And then I will go in and do my next piece, and I'll keep repeating this process over and over again until I have all of my pattern pieces draped. I'm also always making sure that all of my grain lines are exactly perpendicular to the floor and parallel to each other. And then I haven't shown you guys this before, so this is how I pin together my draped pattern pieces. So I turn under and press one of the sides of the seam allowance that we are going to be pinning up, and then I just grab a little bit of both pieces with my pin, and I pin them kind of like perpendicular to the seam so that it's kind of like sewing up the seam but with pins. This is how we learned how to do it in draping class. Thank you, Dr. Porterfield. This is also so useful because by pinning it up now during this part of the process, we can see if our seam lengths also match up at this point. So this is when you can make any adjustments necessary. I'm showing you this is how it looks when it's done, and again, I left space open in the back. I'm cutting everything on the lines that we drew initially so that I can go ahead and make the pattern pieces. So I'm just at this point also checking to make sure the seams do in fact line up again, because I don't want to do all that work and then something doesn't match up. So I'm transferring those pattern pieces to cardstock, and I ended up adjusting the length of the center front because it was a little bit too tall. And then I added seam allowance just on the sides. I added 1/4 inch seam allowance on both sides, but not on the top and bottom because we are going to be applying binding and we don't need to add additional seam allowance for that. Now, if you're making a translucent corset like me, we are going to remove this back panel and save it for later. Now, if you're making an opaque corset out of a shell and lining, then you'll use that back panel and just cut out 2 pieces from each fabric of all the pattern pieces. Now I'm just making sure all my pattern pieces are on grain by using my straight edge to make sure those grain lines on the pattern pieces are parallel to the selvage of this fabric, and then I'm cutting out 2 of each pattern piece except for that back panel again. Now I'm going to go ahead and just sew up all the vertical seam lines of this organza with 1/4 inch seam allowance. It will look like this, a little wonky, so go ahead and press it flat with your iron. Going back to that center back panel, I'm going to cut out 2 layers for each side, so 4 layers total with whatever opaque fabric I'm going to be using. I'm just using this white polyester lining I got from Joann's. And I'm also going to be cutting out 1 interfacing pattern piece for each side, so 2 pieces total. And I'm removing the seam allowance on those interfacing pieces. Now I'm going to be applying both of those interfacing panels onto one of each of the back panels on each side. I'm adding some sort of press cloth on top of the interfacing, so when I press my iron down, the glue doesn't ruin my iron, and then I'm just pressing it until those interfacing pieces are nice and secure onto our back panels. Now I'm going to connect the back panels to each other by stitching a line with a 1/4 inch seam allowance on the side of the panel that has the eyelets and the lace up, not on the side that attaches to the rest of the corset. So I'm just making sure I know which side is actually the side that gets the eyelets, that is in the center back. So it's this side, these sides right here, not that side. That's the side that gets connected to the corset. As you can see, I've labeled the center back of the corset here for you on your pattern piece so you won't get confused. Now I'm just pressing the seam nice and flat and then flipping the pattern pieces with wrong sides together, interface sandwich in the middle, and pressing that seam again. Now I'm going to preemptively press another seam to make life easier for us down the road, and you'll understand what I mean later. So the panel without the interfacing on it, I'm going to fold a 1/4 inch in towards the seam allowance, and I'm going to press that nice and flat. You'll know that you've done it right because it should line up with the interfacing on the other edge. You can clearly see now that when we fold that panel down, it only reaches to the end of the interfacing. Now we are going to attach these back panels to the rest of our organza corset. So we're going to attach it on the interfaced panels, not on the panels without the interfacing. So once you have it attached, you're going to go ahead and press that seam allowance towards the center back, towards the opaque fabric, because when we close that, it is going to be nice and hidden away and beautiful, and we want to make sure our corset also looks good on the inside, not just on the outside. So that's why we're doing that. Now to keep this opaque fabric from just flapping open, we want to top stitch along this seam line on the opaque fabric and catch that fabric on the back side. So it will end up looking like this. It's top stitch 1/8 of an inch away from that seam line, and it looks the same on the front and back. And now it is stable and that fabric is not going anywhere. Okay, now it's time for the boning. So I got this boning from Joann's. It's already cased. It just makes life easier because I don't have to make a beautiful casing for the outside of this corset. So I'm going to be cutting this boning to the exact length of the vertical seam lines on all of those seam lines except for the very center back where the eyelets are going to be. For this, I'm cutting the boning a 1/2 inch shorter than the seam line, and I'm going to make a channel for this boning to go through these 2 layers of fabric. So this boning is about a 1/4 inch wide, so I'm going to sew a seam, sew a channel about 3/8 of an inch wide so I can easily insert that boning back into this channel later. Now I'm also going to make sure that the rest of my boning is about 1/2 an inch shorter than the vertical seam lines as well. We want the casing to be the same length as the vertical seam lines, but all of the boning to be 1/2 an inch shorter, because when we sew the bias tape on later on, we cannot sew through the boning, but we can sew through the casing. Also, I'm going to make sure that my seam allowance does not poke out from the sides of my casing. So I actually had to trim my seam allowance a little bit to make sure it wasn't popping out. And then we're going to pin the casing on top of the seam allowance and enclose that seam allowance, those raw edges, inside the casing. So the corset will look beautiful on both the outside and the inside. Now I'm just attaching the casing onto the corset by just stitching along those lines that are already stitched on the casing, just following those lines and making sure my line is nice and even. And I'm doing that on both sides. Little tip, if you are sewing from the top of the corset to the bottom, like from the top of the casing down towards the bottom of the casing, you want to do that on both sides for your piece of casing and on all the rest of your pieces of casing. You don't want to sew down one piece of casing and then up on another casing. You want to make sure that you're being consistent and sewing the same direction for everything. You might notice that the boning you got on a roll that was already pre-cased is a little wonky, a little curvy, and we definitely don't want that. So we have to press our boning nice and flat. I'm going to put a press cloth, I'm just using a piece of muslin, on top of my boning and then using my iron to press my boning nice and flat. You can do that inside of the casing as well. You don't need a press cloth. You can just press the boning inside the casing with your iron, but I'm always scared of getting dirty residue from my iron onto my fabric. So I took it out of the casing and used a press cloth. And then after that, you got all your straight boning pieces, just insert it into your corset. Now it's time to attach our bias tape. So I leave about a half to an inch of bias tape out on the edge, and then I sew along that first fold on the bias tape. Normally I'd sew this to the right side first and then flip it over to the wrong side. However, since this is see-through, I'm going to do the opposite and sew it to the wrong side and flip it over to the right side. Then I turned under the ends of the bias tape and stitched again in that first fold line to make sure that the ends are nice and secure. And bias tape can be a tricky thing, especially if you have not done it before, so I of course will be leaving a resource to another video all about bias tape down below if you are still confused. Now I'm turning the bias tape over to the right side of the fabric and stitching really close to that seam line, just top stitching it really close, and then that's how we attach our bias tape. Of course, do it to the top and the bottom of the corset. Lastly, all we have to do is insert our eyelets. So first, I like to decide how many eyelets I want to insert. So I want to insert 7, and I'm going to make sure they're equally spaced out and mark that with a pencil. Then I go in with my seam ripper, my X-Acto knife, and scissors to make sure I have the correct size hole before hammering that eyelet in with an anvil and a mallet. And they have tools to create holes, which would be very nifty to have, but I don't have that. And then finally, just lace it up with whatever string or ribbon that you want to use, and you are done. Woo! Okay, so that is how you make a corset belt thing. I'm not really sure what you would call this because, you know, technically, again, it's not really a corset. So let me know what you thought. Let me know if you are going to try it out, if you're gonna pattern it yourself, if you're gonna buy the pattern. Also, definitely comment if you're confused about any of the steps, and I will be sure to help you out, of course. Oh, also, stay tuned because next week I'm going to do a pleated skirt tutorial. I'm going to do like a Euphoria inspired outfit, I think. I'm mostly inspired by Jules because I love her. Yeah, so definitely stay tuned for that. It's no patterns needed. Literally all you need is your waist measurement. If you're not following me on Instagram, also definitely follow me there because I do ask you guys a lot of questions on what you want to see next, and I do Q&As, so definitely give me a follow. It's Kiana Bonolo. I will link it below, and also my TikTok is Kiana Bonolo. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye!